Hello, my name is Emma MacGregor. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to speak with you today. MN 8902 is one of my favorite courses in the program, and I'm sorry I'm not able to be with you live. Today is part one of my presentation series on my master's thesis. In this presentation, I'll be speaking to you about the research journey as I experienced it in my master's thesis. In part two, I'll be sharing more about my thesis specifically and how this process looked for my study. If you have questions as you listen, please feel free to note them down. Dr. Schwind can speak to my experience as well, and I'll provide my email at the end. So you're welcome to contact me with your thoughts and questions. Okay, so I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, the qualitative research journey. So throughout this presentation, I will be using my own photographs to elucidate the research process. Here, I use the image of a forest path as we look ahead to our time together today. I'll be sharing the path of a qualitative research journey from a more general perspective. Just as each forest path is slightly different, so does the unique journey of each research study look. Choices in topic, method, and approach may create variations. So no matter what method or approach you choose, I hope today's presentation provides you a clear overview of what you might expect in a more general sense from a qualitative research study. So first up, when it comes to formulating a study's purpose, I consider this image. There are two sets of footsteps in the snow. You can see at the bottom of the image. The path to the left is well trodden under the cover of a large tree. This may represent the existing knowledge or way of doing things. Perhaps it feels safe to walk there, or at least it's assumed that I would go that way. This is what's already known. It's much easier to stick to the established path. To make a new set of footsteps in deep snow is difficult and it takes effort. To be successful, one must be decisive and motivated, perhaps to see a new vantage point over a nearby valley. Without a good reason to set out on our own, we might falter or turn back. So too, when setting out to conduct a study, a researcher has to consider what is important to them, what they want to learn, what's the phenomenon of interest. These ideas may come from professional practice, personal experience, or a combination of both. They are strongly influenced by the researcher's values and beliefs. And the responses to these prompts form what is sometimes called the why story of the study. A research study is a lot of work, and although it's very rewarding, it's not always fun, and there are many challenges. Why undertake all this work? Without powerful and passionate answers to the question why, your motivation might not be strong enough to carry you through the difficult times, long nights, and challenges ahead. So I recommend do not rush this step. A quick answer about your purpose might come to you, but I challenge you to sit with your initial response and go deeper still. Once the purpose is clear, researchers can begin to form their research question. It won't be finalized until the literature review and synthesis is complete and the gap is clearly identified, but this will be the central guiding question for the entire study. I had mine written out and taped to my office wall to keep me focused. I found there's a lot of knowledge out there, and without the question, it's really easy to get stuck in the details. So next we have the literature review and synthesis. So this is the next key step in laying out your study. This continues to build on your study purpose, and it will help refine the research question too, as I mentioned. Here, a researcher searches the literature to discover what's already known or not known about the phenomenon of interest. Multiple databases provide varying perspectives from multiple disciplines, so it's a good idea to use them. Researchers can use theoretical articles, lay literature, and peer-reviewed sources to better understand their chosen phenomenon. But a word to the wise at this step: before you begin, consult a librarian to help keep your searches organized. Later on, you will be expected to report under search strategy, the dates you found the articles, and how you decided whether an article was relevant to the study or not. So a clear, detailed record of your decisions and your actions will help prevent you from having to redo that work later on. So after you've decided about all that, which articles are relevant to include in your literature synthesis, read all the articles through. Consider what is known, what is not known. How does the information presented shed light on the research question? Whose perspective is accounted for? Whose is missing? Take notes on all these answers. I found printing off the relevant articles was helpful for sorting them into piles, which takes us to the next step. The literature synthesis now is different from a literature review in this way. A synthesis is a written report on literature findings organized by themes. Instead of describing individual articles one at a time, which is known as an annotated bibliography, the literature synthesis deepens our understanding by describing larger groups of articles. For instance, X number of articles focused on this perspective, or Y number of articles reported this quality to the phenomenon. Researchers will also note which research approaches were used in reviewed studies to better understand how they arrived at the presented findings. Typically, researchers will cite multiple sources in their sentences in a literature synthesis. The point here is to provide a dense description of the nature of the extant knowledge. By doing this, the knowledge gap becomes evident to the reader. Look back to the questions you asked yourself earlier. If all this is known about the phenomenon, what is still missing? This is the gap in the literature. Now, look back again to your research question. Does your question meet the gap? Sometimes these reflections will offer an opportunity to further fine-tune your research question to meet the gap in the literature more precisely. In qualitative research, this is a good thing. You will also avoid duplicating the efforts of other researchers. So now, having identified your gap in the literature, the researcher decides how to go about filling this knowledge gap. What data do you want to collect? Who will be your sources of knowledge, your participants? How will you invite them to participate in your study? Once you have the data, how will you analyze it? What theoretical perspective will you apply to help you understand the data? The answers to these questions form the entire methodology of your study. So a good place to start is the method. What approach would be best to undertake this study? Phenomenology, grounded theory, narrative inquiry, ethnography. There are lots to choose from. The choice should always be congruent with your purpose and your question. It all has to flow from there. Perhaps you might look back at the literature synthesis. Is there a method that hasn't been used yet with this phenomenon? What might a different method reveal? Once the method is chosen, again, ensure that the research question is an appropriate fit. Here's another opportunity to adjust the question, this time to match the chosen method. This way, everything will be congruent. Next, the researcher chooses a theoretical framework, which will guide analysis. Here again, you want to choose one that is congruent with the method and the research question. Some methods have a built-in theoretical framework, which you can use, and some do not. No matter what you choose, again, everything needs to be congruent. Next, the research design. This is the nuts and bolts of the study operations. Here, the researcher considers recruitment strategy, data collection techniques, inclusion criteria for participants, and so on. How long should the interviews be? Should they be one-on-one or focus group style? The answer to these questions may be significantly guided by your chosen method. You can look to other studies done with this method to get ideas on how you might design your particular study. Finally, plan how you will evaluate your study afterwards. In a research context, this is measured by ethical standards and criteria for rigor. There are general criteria for rigor in qualitative research, such as transferable, not generalizable findings, for instance, and there are more specific criteria for particular methods. As usual, you will want to choose evaluative criteria that is congruent with your purpose and your method. Consider too your participant demographics. Researcher-participant relationship is a power imbalanced relationship. Are the participants vulnerable in any other way? If so, this might warrant specific ethical considerations. Plan ahead and prepare to attend to these matters. This shows due diligence, protects participants' rights, and strengthens your study, and it's the right thing to do. Once the methodology is established, the researcher is ready to seek Research Ethics Board, or REB, approval. In a thesis or a dissertation context, the researcher student needs the review and permission of their supervisor and committee before applying for REB approval. And applying for REB approval involves sending the written study proposal in and filling in a protocol answering focused questions about the study. REB is focused on protecting participants. And again, their feedback only serves to strengthen your study. There can be some back and forth as the researcher attends to their questions and feedback. Depending on the institution, REB approval can take anywhere from 6 months to longer to obtain. So plan ahead. If you are conducting research only within the university community, you would only need REB approval from that university. But if you're partnering with a community agency, you would need their REB approval too. This can then add extensively to the timeline. So in this situation, it would be recommended to obtain the approval of one organization first, then move to obtain approval from the next one. Once the study has been approved by all relevant research ethics boards, the researcher can begin data collection, which is kind of the fun part. Okay, most qualitative researchers use interviews with participants in some form. But for your study, consider, is it methodologically congruent to include an interview guide with a list of prescribed questions? If not, what are some general questions you might use to prompt and deepen the interview? How many interviews would you like to do with each participant? What would the time interval be between the interviews? Why would this matter? As ever, all the answers to these questions must be congruent with the study purpose, question, and chosen method. Everything flows from there. And in qualitative research, we can collect quite a lot of data. Interviews may be audio recorded and have transcript copies, observational notes, perhaps creative materials. These all bear careful consideration for the storage, security, and confidentiality of the participants. Further, you might consider ownership of the materials. If your participants create art to express their lived experience, for instance, who owns that drawing after it is submitted as data in your study? Data collection often provides an opportunity for the researcher to revisit their ethical criteria. Usually, REB will require these details are attended to prior to the interviews themselves, but it bears consideration again. By far, in qualitative research, the greatest instrument for analysis and data collection is yourself. Therefore, researchers need to be fully present to the experience of data collection to notice nonverbal communication as well as verbal. Details like body language, pauses, intonation, and eye contact communicate important subtext extremely valuable to the interpretation and meaning of what participants share. It is generally recommended to keep a research journal for these observations. And I would also recommend regular reflective practice to stay alert and present with this process. Often breakthroughs come from not what is said, but what is implied. It just takes a degree of awareness to catch those moments. So while data collection may be a brief point in time in your study, pay very close attention during this period. Essential. Analysis. So at this point, the researcher applies the theoretical framework to the study data which was collected. This process is called analysis, and it results in the themes of the study or the data. Usually in qualitative research, this is the most labor-intensive part of this entire study, which is why I included my image of this snail. I took this photo on one of my pandemic walks when I myself was engaged in the analysis of my thesis. Writing is a very big part of this process. I wrote as I engaged with the data, considering what might be the themes and reflecting on these observations. I felt like I was moving so slowly and frustrated by the time it took to fully write and engage with the sheer volume of research data I had collected. What I didn't realize until later is that the important thing is not my pace, but that I kept moving. To engage with the research data, especially the volume of transcripts and audio recordings, it requires a lot of time and sincere reflection. Here especially, my study purpose was essential to motivate me to keep going. I look at this industrious snail straining against the weight of his shell to get to the garden. We both reached our goals and benefited by not rushing ourselves through the hard part. And we did it. So developing now the themes of the data, it can be a little bit like describing this image of a garden. What might be obvious at first sight? The sunflower, the blue sky, the warm brick house. These are surface level observations, but they point to a deeper meaning. How would you describe the meaning of this theme? For me, I think of peace, comfort, home, and nourishment. The meaning I draw from these observations is unique to my own lens as a person and a researcher. And so it is for you too when you interpret this image. The same goes for interpreting themes of qualitative research data. To go past the surface level observation, it benefits us to sit with the data. The process can be embodied too, engaging multiple senses. As ever, engaging in analysis in a way that is congruent with the method, research question, and purpose, always being congruent. Once the themes are established, we return to the literature to elucidate these themes in greater detail. Revisit the initial literature synthesis. Would any of those sources support these findings? Are there any contradictions? What else can you learn about these themes from the literature? Conduct further literature searches and discuss the themes with the synthesis of that new literature. This is where new knowledge is developed, embedded in the existing literature and using the chosen theoretical framework. At this point in the study, after the themes have been discussed, the bulk of the work is complete, but we're not done. What's the benefit of having conducted this research, if not to support society? To demonstrate the relevance of the study, consider the transferability of these findings to practice, education, policy, and future research. Findings often have multidisciplinary implications, so don't feel limited by the discipline you are based in. I think of this point as looking out over this vista. Consider, what horizons could this research reach? Where could it be beneficial? From this vantage point, where could these findings be of service? The sky is the limit. Dissemination is the next step. It's an ethical obligation of researchers to disseminate their research findings. Otherwise, it is a disrespectful use of participants' time and effort. There are two main approaches to dissemination: knowledge translation and knowledge mobilization. In fact, there's a whole research science to dissemination. But when deciding which approach to use, researchers again need to think of what approach is congruent with their study purpose, method, and even their findings. Perhaps a combination of both approaches is a good fit. Here, I include another image of fall. This one of a beloved tree in Trinity Bellwoods Park in Toronto. I think about the leaves of this tree floating down, representing pieces of knowledge and findings gained from a research study. How would I want someone else to experience these leaves? Perhaps by sitting on the grass, watching the leaves gently float down. Perhaps by studying one leaf in great detail, noticing the veins and textures of its surface. Each approach should be considerate of the audience too. What is appropriate for an academic lecture is not the same for school-age children. Experimenting with different audiences can help the researcher elucidate these findings into customized settings. And at the end of a qualitative research journey, as throughout, a period of reflection is warranted. I include this photo that I took one evening on the Toronto Island when the ferry first started allowing visitors to their shores again after the pandemic had begun. Fire always draws me into silent contemplation, staring at the glowing embers. In this spirit, I invite you to consider some reflective prompts that might help you to think about your own research study or your proposal for this course, or even your pursuit of knowledge through education more broadly. I would encourage you, in fact, to think of this assignment as an opportunity to develop both. So what is your purpose for being here in this course? What about in this master's program? What knowledge are you hoping to gain? How will you engage in reflective practice throughout to stay engaged with the knowledge you are being presented with? You can write about this and reflect on this in your own time, but I'll pause in case you want to write it down or snap a picture. So having said all of that, I want to thank you all for your attention and for allowing me to share my perspective on the qualitative research journey with you today. I hope you found this presentation to be informative and supportive towards your own work in this course and beyond. As promised, you can find my email on this slide. Please feel free to contact me there if you have any questions or thoughts for follow-up. I'd love to be able to meet some of you that way. I'm looking forward to sharing with you again at my next presentation, where I'll be sharing the findings of my own thesis study. Take very good care, and until we meet again, talk to you then.